Hi everyone, I've got some late night chess action for you here, so 2 for the price of 1 today. I did stick up a video earlier, a Magnus Carlsen game, and then I was literally just on Lichess, YouTube, saw that this Crypto Cup has started, and Alireza Firouzja is playing, who, as you know, regular viewers of the channel, I love to cover. Now, I thought he wasn't playing until the Sinkfield Cup coming later in the month, in September, but okay, turns out he's in this one, and the pairing today was really tasty. So he was playing against Ramesh Babu Pragnananda, another absolute prodigy, up-and-coming star, and it's the best of 4. So the format here is they play 4 games, it's rapid play chess, 15 minutes, 10 seconds a move, I think. I'm not incorrect in saying. And yeah, it's kind of like tennis, you have to win enough games to then win the set, and tomorrow they get a new pairing. So in the first 2 games, Alireza lost the first one with black, really nice positional game by Pragg. Then in the second one here, Alireza won, actually no, sorry, this is the third. So in the second one, Alireza won with white, and now in the third game, Alireza has black here, Pragg has white, and so it's really a pivotal moment in the match. Whoever wins this one just needs to draw in the final game. So let's see what happened here. We had e4 on the board here from Pragg, and Alireza goes for d6 here. So he's trying to imbalance it straight out of the opening. Now we had d4 and knight f6. So this is the Peertz defense. I always used to say Perk, but I'm pretty sure you're supposed to say Peertz to do the correct pronunciation. So knight c3 played, defends the pawn. e5 strikes at the center, and obviously it immediately looks that white can just do this, chop off the queens, you lose the castling rights. Surely this is just a great game for white, but actually practice shows that black's kind of solid enough. A line like this, kind of like the Berlin endgame, it's not so easy for white to actually break this down, prove advantage. Found a nice game that Magnus Carlsen won from here, for example, back in 2012. Anyway, so we didn't have takes on e5, instead knight f3 was played, and this really makes quite some positional sense, because at the end of the day, white has 2 pawns in the centre here, taking space away from the black pieces. If you take here and then take back with this one, well, now you both have 1 pawn in the centre, you're sharing the central space, so instead white just wants to maintain that central control. Now we had knight b to d7, bishop c4 played, bishop e7 develops, castles from both players, and pawn c6 after rook e1, pawn c6. And this is the thing about the black position here, these pieces need to unravel somehow, but it's not so easy. So a4 now from Pragg, after c6, often black wants to go b5, sometimes then you go b4, kick this knight, then e4 could be weaker, so a4 is very logical, you take that queenside space, h6 from black, h3 from white, very logical, give the king some space. Rook e8 played by Alireza, and now pawn a5 from Pragg, a nice clamping move, and bishop f8 from Alireza. Again, a very common positional idea. You open up the rook, if black ever takes here, well then you're pressuring e4, and often you're going g6, rerouting this bishop so it can find some work on the long diagonal here. Now we had bishop e3 developing, and this is where Alireza now takes in the center, so he chops on d4 here. We had bishop recaptures, and now he goes queen to c7. And there's a real harmony about his play here. He's making the best of a cramped position, so he's initiated a pawn exchange, and now he's got some stuff going on the dark squares. He's opened up the rook. The bishop could be coming here as mentioned, so okay, he's got the kind of imbalanced position that he would have been looking for. So bishop a2 now from Pragg, he anticipates knight e5, hitting c4, now that knight jumps to the square, and now knight h4 here from Pragg, again a nice move, he looks at this sensitive f5 point, and he also releases this f-pawn. That's a very common idea for white here, take back control of this e5 square. So Alireza goes bishop e6. He wants to challenge that powerful light squared bishop. Here we had takes on e6, and now the rook recaptures. You'd never want to go with the pawn. It's an ugly move. You now block the file for the rook. You weaken this square, and how's this bishop ever really getting into the game? g6 is now much harder to achieve. So we had rook recaptures instead. Much more logical. It does let the knight to f5, yes, but now Alireza decides to kick that one immediately. He goes pawn g6, and Pragg had a think here. He was potentially looking at this f4 move, which is the top engine move, and it's a nice idea that if black takes here, well then you recapture like this, you hit the rook, and then you take the knight, and you've got this better pawn structure now, exposed black king, although black wouldn't have been obliged, so coming back here, wouldn't be obliged to take on f5, so you could drop the knight back, for example, then knight g3, but at least now you've covered the e5 square with the f-pawn. So this was technically the best move. Instead, Pragg went knight h4 here, but it looks a bit ugly on the edge of the board, and he has to spend some time bringing it back into the game now. So Alireza does the same, moves that knight to the edge. Have the super GMs gone mad? Well, okay, it's all about these dark squares once again, plus he looks to open up this bishop. Very tactical move. g3 played, covers the f4 square, and now Alireza goes queen d8. Again, a very thematic idea. Sometimes the knight lands on f4, then if pawn takes, well, the queen is on the knight, and just generally he's moving onto these dark squares once again. So knight g2 played by Pragg. He gets out of those tactics, wants to reroute like this, maybe support f4, once the king covers g3, that is. Now knight d7 from Alireza, he opens up those dark squares, king h2 played, the knight now rerouted back into f6 here, the pawn covers this square, and now f4 from Pragg, he takes that space, but bishop g7 played, and Alireza can start generating some tricks now. So queen d3 from Pragg, he connects his rooks. Now we had queen coming back to c7, looks at this e5 move here, and so Pragg changes plans. He goes rook f1, and he now wants to start playing for f5 here, break down those light squares. So pawn a6 from Alireza, he frees up this rook to join the battle, doesn't have to babysit the pawn. And now f5 from Pragg, he doesn't hang about. You know, he could play some more waiting moves like knight e3, but he's playing very direct now. This is rapid, and the clock times are getting down, as we can see. But when you play f5, although it's a nice move, ripping open the king and the f-file, you do give up this e5 square, and Alireza immediately pounces on that square now. So he hits the queen, which is why you can't yet take the rook. And after bishop takes, rook recaptures, that's the trick. You then recapture, getting the rook out of the attack, and Pragg takes on g6, opening up that f-file. The pawn recaptures. Now knight h4 played, looks at this sensitive pawn, the king covers, and now the knight hops back to f3. It's just improved itself a bit, and Alireza can already actually pick up this a pawn here, and you could see a line which goes something like this, where he gives up on d6, but this is absolutely classic Alireza. So instead of going for this one, you know, still a decent game, he goes for something much more tricky here. So he plays rook h5. He ignores this pawn for the moment, threatens knight g4 check, and if white ever goes b4, defending this one, well then this diagonal becomes even weaker, especially the c3 square. So knight e2 was now played by Pragg. He tries to bring that one round, looking at f4. Alireza jumps in with a check, king g2 played, and now the knight hits e5. We see a trade on e5, rook recaptures, and black is really starting to get into the driving seat now. These dark squares are just a killer for Pragg, plus this pawn is weak and isolated here. So rook f4 was played, tries to give the pawn some cover. Now this one doubled on the file. We had rook a to f1, and again you can pick up this pawn. Alireza plays this one, however. He doesn't want to let the rook invade. You know, he's also looking for Pragg's plans. And now b4 from Pragg, he covers that pawn, but Alireza finds an excellent shot in this position now. This pawn that's been sitting there dormant all game, bang, he goes pawn d5, and the whole position is now just really loose for Pragg. You know, you'd like to take this pawn, but then this is the problem, the rooks are slamming down, you're losing a piece. So Pragg has to wait on the position. He goes knight c3, covers e4 some more, and Alireza goes queen d6. Another good move. Again, you still can't take here, even though the knight has now moved. Well, now the problem is rook to e3. You hit the queen and you x-ray this knight, which is already attacked by the bishop. You know, the weakness of that b4 move. So this is no good. You could try knight e4 counter-attacking, but then we simply take with the rook. Queen's still attacked. And okay, the whole thing's just completely over. You can even take on g3 in such a position as this. Anyway, so we didn't have takes on d5. Instead, this rook came to f3, you know, covering this square in some lines, covering the queen. And now Alireza did have an opportunity here to simplify the game a little. So he could have gone d4, kicked this knight, and just mopped up these queenside pawns. He would have meant giving this d4 pawn, but then after you take this one here, well, you've got nice queenside pawns. This one's still weak. You've cleared the diagonal for the bishop, so this would have been a decent way to play. But as ever, he wants to keep pieces on the board, keep it tricky, so he goes queen e6 instead. Now we had takes on d5, the pawn recaptures, but the knight still doesn't have any good jumps right now, so it jumps back to d1, preparing to cover the king here, and after rook e2 check, that's what Pragg does. He plays like this, but now his pieces are just getting absolutely tied in knots. And here Alireza missed a really powerful shot, so this pawn is desperately weak, along with this square, and rook c7 just exploits all of that. The best move here is actually b5, but then we slam down. You can't actually protect that pawn, and okay, the line goes on like this, but black is just simply better, completely giving white the runaround in this position here. But we didn't have rook c7. Alireza missed it. Instead, he goes for this d4 move, and it makes some sense to cut the board in half, but it's kind of ugly to blunt out your own bishop so early in the game. Now we had queen b3 from Pragg. Not the most accurate move, but he is low on time. He's down to 22 seconds, and Alireza finds an excellent response here. So he goes queen to c6, and now look at this rook, just pinned to the king. This one's on the 7th, this one could come and join the party, and Pragg barely has any moves here. So he goes pawn h4, gives some room for the king. h5 now from Alireza, the queen comes back to d3, the rook invaded on the 3rd, the queen moves away, and now here Alireza makes a shocking decision, and you can really see he's not in the top form of his life. And I was just looking at the clock time there, so he's down to 20 seconds versus 28. He lost some of that time advantage here, and here he decides to take the queens off the board. But you could just snap off this pawn. Say you take with the rook, and what does white actually do? I mean, you can invade like this, but then the rook can simply swing back, and black just retains all of the trumps in the position. I mean, here the computer wants to either give up the rook for the bishop or play king f1, and then you can give up 2 rooks for the queen. I mean, really the position is just completely tied in knots, but Alireza doesn't take that pawn with the rook. Instead, he takes with the queen. You know, really rusty this year it feels. And now when the queens come off, he's just got rid of an advantage of about 7 pawns. He's about -7 something on this Lichess engine here, Stockfish. And then when he takes the queens off, the position's now basically level. He's -0.3. Just crazy decision from him. So rook f7 was now played, and this is the problem. Pragg's getting all this counterplay here, and after king h6, breaking the pin of the bishop, now we had takes here. This rook came to e2, the rook comes behind the pawn, and now Alireza's next move is slightly strange. He just gives up on this pawn. He could have gone, say, rook to e6, just defended this 6th rank here, and the bishop still holds the pawn for the time being, but he wanted to retain these attacking threats, so he goes pawn d3, he gives that pawn immediately, leaves his rooks on the 7th, now rook b2 comes behind this one, rook d7 back, rook e to d2 now attacks this rook. He didn't have to force this exchange, but I don't think he liked the look of this rook coming down to the 7th. So we had an exchange here like this, and now Pragg starts wiggling out of the box. So king f1, the bishop comes to d4. This knight now hits d3, covers this pawn, looks to jump to c5. Alireza goes g5, so he tries to get rid of that backwards pawn. He does achieve it, but after knight c5, pressuring a6, he now has to give bishop for knight. First he flicks in this takes, Then he takes here, pawn recaptures, and he's just a clear pawn down in this position, struggling to now hold the draw, having been so far ahead. So rook c2 played, comes behind the pawn, Pragg checks, king g7, and now you could pick up this a pawn here, then Alireza takes here, but arguably that's going to be easier for Alireza to hold the draw. So instead rook c6 from Pragg, excellent move. Now king f7, the two kings march in here. This rook is hit, slides up to c4, hits this one, and this is really Alireza's source of counterplay here. So the king comes over, we have this one captured, this one marches in, and now after Pragg picks up this a pawn, this is the battle. Can Alireza hold these queenside pawns at bay before his own pawn gets going? So king b3, the rook slides back, now king to b4, king d7 comes across. You really want this king situated on the c7 square here. Rook h6 comes behind these pawns, and Alireza now starts checking. So he gives this king the runaround, forces it to the a file, and he's really got the optimal defensive setup in this position here, because the king is boxed in, the c pawn can't yet move past c6, and this one has to be watched by white. So what we should have had here was, say, king to c7. Now if the rook takes, you can go king c6, rook h7 for example, and the point is that eventually black's going to mop up the pawn. This is one sample line. I'm not saying this is easy to find over the board, but this is the kind of thing we could get, and this should be a technical draw. You keep checking the king. But if we run back here, we didn't have king c7 played. Instead Alireza goes rook to a1. He steps off this b file and lets the king out of the box, and now you can go king b7. Excellent move. And it has to be b7, not b6, because now when you check, then you block with the rook here. This is the key thing. And if you chop off this one, well, now the king can recapture. That's quite important, so that if we queen here as black, we're not on this diagonal. And then you can go this kind of variation here. And okay, the white pawns are just coming through way too fast. This would actually be mate, or if the king steps this way, king d8, well, this pawn goes through, etc. It's all just over. The white pawns are too fast. So rook c1 was played. Now we had c6 check, king d6, rook b2, nice waiting move from Pragg. He covers this one, asks Alireza what he wants to do. h3 played, a6, h2, rook d2 check, king c5, and after Pragg took here, we had rook b1 check, king c7, and here Alireza resigned. Why did he resign? Well, say you go rook a1, coming behind this pawn. This is one sample line. We can check the king, it moves away, and then we come back. And although you can check again, we hide out over here, and now the king is blocking the c file from this pawn going through. So say rook c1, pawn c7, king d3 gets out the way, but then king b6. And now if we check the king, well, we can form this bridge, that classic Lucena position I mentioned on an earlier video, and this is all just over for white. So I hope you enjoyed this game. I'll be back tomorrow with some more action. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.